The radio crackled with static as Major Sarah "Ghost" Martinez banked her A-10 Thunderbolt, too hard left, the twin engines screaming against the desert wind. Below her, the smoking remains of forward operating base Redemption painted the Afghan landscape in shades of black and orange. She could see the tiny figures of soldiers scrambling between burning structures, their movements frantic and desperate against the canvas of destruction. Preparing and narrating this type of story took U.S. long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Ghost, this is Tower. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Do you copy? Colonel Bradley's voice cut through the static, sharp and commanding. But Sarah's eyes were locked on the scene below, on the makeshift medical tent where medics were dragging wounded soldiers, on the ammunition depot still sending plumes of smoke into the crystalline desert sky, on the perimeter where her brothers and sisters in arms were making their last stand against an enemy that had caught them completely off guard. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had been in the briefing room at Bagram Air Base, nursing her third cup of coffee and listening to intelligence reports about increased Taliban activity in the Wardak province. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the other pilots, faces that had grown harder and more weathered with each passing month of deployment. Captain Danny "Hawk" Rodriguez sat to her right methodically, cleaning his glasses while studying aerial photographs. To her left, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Phoenix Santos traced flight paths on a tablet, her calloused fingers moving with the precision of someone who had made these calculations 1,000 times before. Sarah had been scheduled for a routine patrol mission, a milk run, they called it. 3 hours of flying lazy circles over friendly territory, checking in with ground units, and returning home in time for lunch. She had strapped herself into the cockpit of her beloved A-10, running through her pre-flight checklist with the same methodical care she had practiced since her days at the Air Force Academy. The aircraft responded to her touch like an old friend, every switch and gauge familiar beneath her gloved hands. The A-10 wasn't the prettiest bird in the Air Force inventory, with its straight wings, twin tail, and that massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from its nose like the stinger of some prehistoric beast. It looked more like a flying tank than a graceful fighter jet, but Sarah loved every ungainly inch of it. This particular aircraft, tail number 80-10965, had been her mount for 8 months now. She had named her Righteous Fury, a name painted in bold letters beneath the canopy, alongside 23 mission markers, each one representing a successful close air support mission, where she had brought her fellow soldiers home alive. The aircraft's history stretched back decades. Built in 1981, she had served in the Gulf War, patrolling the no-fly zones over Iraq, and had been upgraded multiple times to keep pace with modern warfare. The maintenance log showed she had accumulated over 8,000 flight hours, time spent in the cockpits of dozens of pilots who had trusted their lives to her titanium armor and redundant systems. Sarah often wondered about those other pilots, about the missions they had flown, about the soldiers they had saved. But 30 minutes into what should have been a routine patrol, everything changed. The radio had exploded with desperate voices. Forward operating base Redemption was under coordinated attack. A Taliban force, larger and better organized than anything intelligence had predicted, had surrounded the base and was systematically destroying it with mortar, rocket-propelled grenades, and small arms fire. The base's air defenses had been knocked out in the opening minutes of the assault, leaving the 300 soldiers trapped inside, with no way to call for immediate air support. Ghost, I repeat, you are ordered to return to base. Colonel Bradley's voice came through again, more insistent now. Sarah could picture him in the command center, his weathered face creased with concern and frustration, his gray hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, a nervous habit he had developed during his third deployment. She had served under Bradley for 2 years now, and she respected him immensely. He was a careful commander, one who weighed risks and followed protocols, one who had kept more pilots alive than he had lost. But sometimes Sarah knew careful wasn't enough. The tactical display in her cockpit showed the full scope of the disaster below. Red icons indicated enemy positions in a rough circle around the base. Friendly forces were compressed into an ever-shrinking blue zone at the center. Intelligence estimates put the attacking force at over 500 fighters, a massive concentration that had somehow moved into position without being detected by satellite, surveillance, or human intelligence networks. Sarah keyed her radio. "Tower, this is Ghost. I have eyes on Redemption. They need immediate air support, permission to engage." The pause that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though Sarah's chronometer showed it was only 12 seconds. When Colonel Bradley's voice returned, it carried the weight of command and the burden of impossible decisions. "Negative, Ghost. You are not authorized for engagement. Higher command is coordinating a response. Return to base." But Sarah was already studying her weapons display. 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles hung from her wing pylons, each one capable of destroying an armored vehicle or fortified position. Her GAU-8 cannon was loaded with 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium shells, enough firepower to cut through enemy positions like a scythe through wheat. Most importantly, she carried 4 CBU-97 cluster bombs, each one designed to clear large areas of soft targets. It was exactly the kind of loadout needed for the situation below. The A-10 had been designed for this moment. Every system, every redundancy, every piece of armor plating had been engineered with one purpose in mind: getting close to the enemy and delivering devastating firepower in support of ground troops. The aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. Its engines were mounted high on the fuselage to reduce the chance of foreign object damage from debris kicked up during low-level flight. The cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub that could stop armor-piercing rounds. The flight controls were manually operated, not dependent on hydraulics that could be severed by enemy fire. Sarah banked the aircraft again, bringing herself into position for a strafing run on the enemy positions along the base's northern perimeter. Through her targeting pod, she could see muzzle flashes from Taliban fighters who had taken cover behind a low ridge. They were pouring automatic weapons fire into the base, keeping the defenders pinned down while other fighters moved mortar into position for the final assault. "Ghost, this is Redemption Actual." The new voice on the radio was rough, strained with exhaustion and pain. Sarah recognized it immediately. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the base commander. They had served together at Kandahar 2 years earlier, and she knew him as a soldier's soldier, someone who would never ask for help unless his people were truly desperate. "We have multiple casualties and are running low on ammunition. We need air support now, or we're not going to make it." Sarah's heart pounded against her chest. She could see the base's defensive positions crumbling under the sustained assault. Smoke was pouring from the motor pool where several vehicles had been destroyed by RPG fire. The communications tower lay twisted and broken, its antenna array scattered across the compound. Most critically, she could see enemy fighters advancing on the main gate, their assault clearly in its final phase. "Redemption Actual, this is Ghost. I see you. Help is coming." She switched back to the command frequency. "Tower, this is Ghost. Redemption is about to be overrun. I can stop this attack, but I need authorization now." Colonel Bradley's response came immediately, his voice tight with authority and barely controlled anger. "Ghost, you are explicitly ordered to return to base. Do not engage. A full strike package is being organized. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Sarah looked at her tactical display again, watching the red icons continue their inexorable advance toward the blue zone. 20 minutes was a lifetime in combat. In 20 minutes, forward operating base redemption would be nothing but smoking. Ruins and body bags. 300 American soldiers would be dead because she followed orders instead of doing what was right. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She thought about her oath as an Air Force officer to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She thought about the Air Force core values drilled into her since basic training: integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. Most importantly, she thought about the warriors on the ground below, soldiers who had volunteered to serve their country and now found themselves abandoned by the very system they had sworn to protect. Sarah keyed her radio one more time. "Tower, this is Ghost." Unable to comply. "There are American soldiers dying down there." She rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, the aircraft's nose pointing directly at the enemy positions along the northern ridge. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. At 4,000 feet, she pulled the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted in a sustained burst of fury, the distinctive brr-throtuk sound echoing across the desert as 30mm shells tore into the Taliban positions. The cannon fired at 3,900 rounds per minute, each shell weighing almost 2 pounds and traveling at 3,500 feet per second. The depleted uranium penetrators could punch through tank armor, and they turned the rocky outcropping where the enemy fighters had taken cover into a moonscape of pulverized stone and twisted metal. Sarah pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her ejection seat as she climbed back to altitude. Behind her, secondary explosions bloomed as her cannon fire found ammunition caches and fuel stores. But there was no time to admire her handiwork. The tactical display showed more enemy positions that needed to be eliminated. "Ghost! Ghost! This is redemption actual. Outstanding work. You just saved our lives." Colonel Thompson's voice came through the radio, filled with relief and gratitude. But Sarah was already lining up for her next attack run. The radio crackled again with Colonel Bradley's voice, and this time there was no mistaking the cold fury in his tone. "Major Martinez, you are in direct violation of orders. Return to base immediately, or I will have you court-martialed." Sarah didn't respond. She was too busy selecting her next target, a cluster of enemy mortar that had been systematically pounding the base's ammunition depot. She rolled inverted and dove again, this time releasing one of her Maverick missiles at 3,000 feet. The missile's infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of a recently fired mortar tube, and the weapon streaked downward like a guided lightning bolt. The explosion when it hit was spectacular, a fireball that rose 200 feet into the air as the missile found not just the mortar position, but also a cache of artillery shells that had been stockpiled nearby. The shockwave rattled the windows in Sarah's cockpit, even at her altitude of 6,000 feet. But as she climbed away from the target area, Sarah noticed something troubling on her radar display. 2 fast-moving contacts were approaching from the east. F-16 Fighting Falcons, most likely launched from Bagram to intercept her and force her to return to base. She recognized the tactical situation immediately. Colonel Bradley wasn't bluffing about the court-martial. He had scrambled fighters to bring her home, by force if necessary. The irony wasn't lost on her. American pilots, flying American aircraft, sent to stop her from saving American soldiers. But Sarah had made her choice, and she wasn't turning back now. She keyed her radio to the frequency used by the soldiers on the ground. "Redemption actual, this is Ghost. I've got company coming, but I'm not finished with our friends on the ridgeline. Talk to me about targets." Colonel Thompson's response was immediate. "Ghost, we've got enemy infantry massing for an assault on the south gate. Grid reference 41, RPR 12345, 67,890. Also seeing movement in the wadi to our east. Looks like they're trying to flank us." Sarah consulted her moving map display. cross-referencing the grid coordinates with her targeting system. The enemy positions were clearly marked now, dark clusters of heat signatures moving across the desert floor like deadly ants. She selected one of her cluster bombs and began her approach. The CBU-97 was a sensor-fused weapon, designed to detect and destroy armored vehicles over a wide area. But it was equally effective against massed infantry formations. Sarah released the weapon at 8,000 feet and watched as it separated into 40 individual submunitions that spread across the enemy. Assault formation like deadly flowers blooming in the desert air. The results were devastating. Dozens of enemy fighters simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the submunitions-shaped charge warheads. The Taliban assault on the South Gate dissolved into chaos as survivors fled in all directions, their coordinated attack broken by the sudden appearance of air power they hadn't expected. But Sarah's moment of triumph was short-lived. Her radar warning receiver began chirping insistently, indicating that one of the approaching F-16s had achieved radar lock. A moment later, her radio came alive with a new voice, one she recognized immediately. "Righteous Fury, this is Viper Lead, Major Martinez. You are ordered to proceed to heading 090 and return to base immediately. Acknowledge." Captain Jake Viper Patterson had been Sarah's classmate at the Air Force Academy and her closest friend in the squadron. They had flown training missions together, shared countless conversations over beers at the officers' club, and had even dated briefly during their junior year at Colorado Springs. Jake was a skilled pilot and a good man, but right now he was the instrument of a command structure that was willing to let American soldiers die in the name of proper procedure. "Viper Lead, this is Ghost." Sarah's voice was calm, professional. "I can't do that, Jake. There are still people alive down there who need my help. Sarah, please." Jake's voice carried a note of personal appeal that cut through the military formality. "Don't make me do this. Colonel Bradley is furious. If you come back now, maybe we can work something out. Maybe it won't be as bad as it could be." Sarah looked down at forward operating base Redemption. The base was still under attack, though her intervention had clearly disrupted the enemy's battle plan. She could see soldiers moving between defensive positions, taking advantage of the breathing space she had bought them to redistribute ammunition and tend to their wounded. But there were still enemy positions that needed to be eliminated. Still, Taliban fighters who were regrouping for another assault. "Jake, I took an oath," she said quietly. "Same oath you took. To support and defend. Those soldiers down there are depending on me." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. When Jake's voice returned, it was heavy with reluctance and regret. "Sarah, I've got orders to use whatever force is necessary to bring you back. Please don't make me follow those orders." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Jake had been authorized to shoot her down if she refused to return to base. The thought was almost incomprehensible. American pilots firing on American aircraft because one pilot had chosen to save American soldiers instead of following the chain of command. But she also understood the position Jake was in. He was following orders, just as she was following her conscience. "I understand, Viper Lead," she replied. "Do what you have to do." But as she spoke, Sarah was already maneuvering into position for another attack run. She had spotted a concentration of enemy vehicles, technicals mounting heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, that were providing fire support for the ground assault on the base. One more Maverick missile could eliminate that threat and give the defenders an even better chance of holding out until proper reinforcements arrived. The missile streaked away from her wing pylon, guided by its infrared seeker toward the heat signature of the largest technicals engine. Sarah didn't wait to see the results. She was already pulling up and away, climbing toward the safety of higher altitude while her radar warning receiver painted an increasingly urgent picture of the F-16s maneuvering into attack position. behind her. But as she climbed, something extraordinary happened. Her radio crackled with a new voice, one she didn't recognize, but one that spoke with unmistakable authority. "All aircraft, this is Sabre Actual. I am ordering an immediate stand down of all intercept operations. Ghost, you are authorized to continue your mission. I repeat, Ghost is authorized to continue close air support operations at Forward Operating Base Redemption." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she processed what she had just heard. Sabre was the call sign for the commanding general of air operations. In Afghanistan, a 3-star general who had apparently intervened in the situation. Somehow, word of what was happening had reached the highest levels of command, and someone with the authority to override Colonel Bradley had decided that saving American lives was more important than military protocol. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Jake's voice came through the radio, now professional but relieved. "Ghost, this is Viper Lead. We're cleared to provide escort. What do you need?" Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her old friend and toward whatever chain of events had led to this moment of sanity in an insane situation. She quickly scanned her tactical display, looking for the remaining enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to the soldiers below. "Viper Lead, I've got multiple targets along the eastern ridge. Enemy mortar and machine gun positions. Can you take the northern cluster while I work the southern approach?" "Roger that, Ghost. Viper 2 and I are moving to engage." For the next 20 minutes, the 3 American aircraft worked in deadly concert above Forward Operating Base Redemption. Sarah's A-10 served as the primary close air support platform, using her cannon and remaining missiles to eliminate enemy strong points with surgical precision. The 2 F-16s provided top cover and struck targets of opportunity with their own guided weapons. Together, they systematically dismantled the Taliban attack, turning what had been a coordinated assault by hundreds of fighters into a scattered rout. By the time Sarah's weapons were expended, the enemy forces were in full retreat. The base's perimeter was secure, the wounded were being evacuated to the medical facilities, and the immediate crisis was over. Sarah made one final low pass over the base, waggling her wings in salute to the soldiers who had held the line while she fought the battle above them. But as she turned toward home, climbing away from the scene of her greatest victory and potentially her greatest downfall, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what would be waiting for her when she landed. The general's intervention had saved the mission and probably her career, but she had still directly disobeyed orders from her immediate superior. Colonel Bradley was not the type of man to forget such insubordination. Regardless of the outcome, the flight back to Bagram gave her time to think about what she had done and why she had done it. The A-10 flew steadily through the Afghan sky, her engines humming their familiar song, while Sarah wrestled with the implications of her actions. She had saved lives, she was certain of that. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Redemption would go home to their families because she had chosen conscience over compliance. But she had also violated the military structure that made such rescues possible in the first place. As the familiar outline of Bagram Air Base appeared on the horizon, Sarah keyed her radio one last time. "Tower, this is Ghost, requesting permission to land." The response came immediately, Colonel Bradley's voice as cold and formal as Arctic wind. "Ghost, you are cleared to land on runway 21. Upon landing, you will taxi directly to the operations building. Do not shut down your aircraft. Do not exit your aircraft. Is that understood?" "Roger, Tower. Understood." Sarah brought the A-10 down through the pattern, her landing as precise and professional as any she had ever made. But as she taxied toward the operations building, she could see the crowd of people waiting for her, maintenance crews, fellow pilots, and in the center of it all, Colonel Bradley himself, his face set in hard lines that promised a reckoning. The engines wound down to silence as Sarah finally shut down the aircraft systems. She sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, her hands resting on the controls that had served her so faithfully, looking out at the people who would determine her fate. Then she unstrapped herself, opened the canopy, and climbed down to face whatever consequences awaited her. But as her feet touched the ground, something unexpected happened. Instead of the hostile reception she had anticipated, she found herself surrounded by maintenance crews who were cheering and applauding. Captain Rodriguez was there, grinning broadly and giving her a thumbs up. Even some of the ground personnel she barely knew were looking at her with expressions of respect and admiration. It was only then that Sarah realized the full scope of what had happened. Word of the battle at Forward Operating Base Redemption had already spread throughout the base. Everyone knew that she had disobeyed orders to save American lives, and everyone knew that her actions had made the difference between victory and disaster. In the eyes of the enlisted personnel and junior officers, she wasn't a rogue pilot who had violated military discipline. She was a hero who had done what was right when it mattered most. But Colonel Bradley was not applauding the disciplinary. Hearing was scheduled for 0800 hours the following morning, but Sarah found herself awake at 0400, staring at the ceiling of her quarters while the air conditioning unit hummed its mechanical lullaby. Sleep had become a stranger to her in the 3 weeks since the incident at Forward Operating Base Redemption. 3 weeks during which she had been grounded pending investigation, her flight status revoked, her future hanging in the balance. Like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads, she rolled out of her narrow bunk and padded to the small mirror mounted above her sink, studying the reflection that greeted her in the harsh fluorescent light. At 32, Major Sarah Martinez carried herself with the confident bearing of a pilot who had logged over 1,800 flight hours in combat zones. But the past weeks had left their mark. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, and her usually perfect military bearing showed signs of the stress that had become her constant companion. Her quarters in the officers' housing unit were spartanly furnished: a single bed, a metal desk, a small dresser, and a folding chair that had seen better days. The walls were bare except for her commission certificate and a single photograph, her flight school class standing in front of a T-6 Texan trainer. 22 young officers with bright smiles and boundless optimism about their futures in military aviation. She wondered how many of those classmates would have made the same choice she had made over Forward Operating Base Redemption. Sarah's morning routine had become a ritual of deliberate normalcy in the face of uncertainty. She began with 50 push-ups, the familiar burn in her shoulders and arms a welcome distraction from the anxious thoughts that circled her mind like vultures. Then came the shower, exactly 5 minutes under water that was never quite hot enough, followed by the careful ritual of donning her dress blue uniform. The uniform felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the weight of her actions had settled into the fabric itself. Each ribbon and decoration told a story of service and sacrifice. The Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters for her close air support missions in Iraq, the Combat Action Medal for coming under enemy fire, the Air Force Commendation Medal for exceptional meritorious service. But would any of that matter when she faced a disciplinary board in 4 hours? She walked to the officers' mess hall as the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn. The base was already stirring to life around her: maintenance, crews heading out to the flight line, security forces beginning their morning patrols, the steady rhythm of military life continuing regardless of her personal crisis. The familiar sounds and sights should have been comforting, but instead they reminded her of everything she stood to lose. The mess hall was nearly empty at this early hour, occupied only by shift workers grabbing coffee before heading home and early risers like herself who couldn't sleep. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee from the industrial-sized dispenser and settled into a corner booth, spreading the morning briefing materials across the scarred formica table. She wasn't scheduled to fly, hadn't been scheduled to fly in 3 weeks, but old habits died hard. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah looked up to see Captain Danny Rodriguez approaching with his own cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs that looked marginally more appetizing than usual. Danny had been her wingman on 17 combat missions, a quiet, methodical pilot whose steady presence had been a constant source of reassurance in some very dangerous skies. "Of course," she replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. "Can't sleep either?" Danny settled into the booth and took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Been thinking about what you did," he said quietly. "About what I would have done in the same situation." This was a conversation they had been dancing around for weeks. Danny, like most of the other pilots in the squadron, had been supportive of her actions in private while maintaining careful neutrality in public. The politics of the situation were treacherous. Openly supporting a pilot who had disobeyed direct orders could be career suicide, even if that pilot had saved American lives in the process. "And what conclusion did you reach?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about her friend's perspective. Danny was quiet for a long moment, stirring his eggs while he considered his words. "I think," he said finally, "that you did what any of us would have wanted to do. The question is whether the rest of us would have had the courage to actually do it." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Sarah understood what Danny was telling her, that her actions had been right, but that the personal cost might be more than most people were willing to pay. She had risked everything to save soldiers she had never met, and now she had to live with the consequences of that choice. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, the squadron's executive officer and Sarah's direct supervisor. Maria was a 15-year veteran who had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts, a pilot's pilot who commanded respect through competence rather than rank. She approached their table with 2 cups of coffee in her hands, an expression that was carefully neutral. "Morning, you two," Maria said, settling into the booth beside Danny. "Figured I might find you here, Sarah. Big day today." "That's one way to put it," Sarah replied with a weak smile. "Any word from upstairs about how this is likely to go?" Maria's expression grew more serious. "Officially, I can't discuss ongoing disciplinary proceedings with you. Unofficially, ... She paused, glancing around the nearly empty mess hall to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The investigation team has been thorough. They've interviewed everyone who had radio contact with you that day, reviewed all the tactical recordings, and analyzed every aspect of your decision-making process." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. And the picture that emerges is complicated," Maria continued. "On one hand, you clearly violated direct orders from your superior officer. The chain of command exists for good reasons, and military discipline is fundamental to effective operations. The investigating officer has documented multiple instances where you were explicitly ordered to return to base and failed to comply." This was what Sarah had been expecting, the formal, by-the-book analysis that would focus on her insubordination rather than her results. But Maria wasn't finished. "On the other hand," the lieutenant colonel continued, "your actions directly resulted in saving the lives of 127 American service members who would have died if forward operating base redemption had fallen. The base commander's after-action report makes it clear that your intervention was the decisive factor in repelling the enemy attack. General Morrison's decision to authorize your continued operations suggests that someone at the highest levels of command believed your actions were justified." Danny leaned forward, his breakfast forgotten. "So what does that mean for the hearing?" Maria shrugged, but her expression remained troubled. "It means that Sarah's case has become something of a cause célèbre at higher headquarters. There are those who want to make an example of her to preserve military discipline, and there are those who want to give her a medal for saving American lives. The politics are ... complex." Sarah absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of her was grateful to know that her actions had support at high levels, But another part of her was troubled by the idea that her fate was being decided by political considerations rather than military justice. She had made her choice based on the immediate tactical situation and her assessment of what was right. The broader implications had been secondary to the lives at stake. "Have you thought about what you're going to say at the hearing?" Maria asked gently. Sarah had thought about little else for the past 3 weeks. She had rehearsed her defense in her mind countless times, exploring different approaches and arguments that might justify her actions. But in the end, it all came down to a simple truth. She had been faced with a choice between following orders and saving lives, and she had chosen to save lives. "I'm going to tell the truth," she said simply. "I'm going to explain my thought process, the tactical situation as I saw it, and the reasons why I believed immediate action was necessary. Beyond that, she shrugged. Beyond that, I'll let the board decide whether what I did was right or wrong." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another familiar face, Chaplain Captain Robert Chun, the base chaplain who had become an unexpected friend and counselor during Sarah's grounding. Chaplain Chun was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had served 2 previous deployments as a military chaplain and had developed a reputation for being available to anyone who needed to talk, regardless of their religious background or lack thereof. "Good morning," the chaplain said, approaching their table with his characteristic gentle smile. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to check in with you before this morning's proceedings." "Of course, Chaplain," Sarah replied, genuinely glad to see him. Their conversations over the past weeks had been among the few bright spots in an otherwise difficult period. "Please join us." Chaplain Chun settled into the booth, his presence somehow making the space feel more peaceful. Despite the gravity of the situation they were discussing. "How are you holding up?" he asked Sarah, his concern evident in his voice. "Some days better than others," Sarah admitted. "Last night was rough. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the things I should have done differently." "Regrets are natural," the chaplain said gently, "but dwelling on them isn't productive. You made a decision based on the information you had and the values you hold dear. That's all any of us can do." Danny nodded in agreement. "The thing is, Sarah, every pilot in this squadron has been in situations where they had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. The only difference is that your decision happened to violate a direct order." "That's a pretty significant difference," Sarah pointed out wryly. "Is it?" Chaplain Chun asked quietly. "Throughout history, there have been moments when individuals had to choose between obedience to authority and obedience to conscience. The fact that you chose conscience doesn't make you a rebel. It makes you human." The chaplain's words struck a chord with Sarah, resonating with thoughts and feelings she had been struggling to articulate for weeks. She had been raised to respect authority, to follow the chain of command, to trust in the system that had shaped her from a young second lieutenant into an experienced combat pilot. But she had also been raised to value human life above all else, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Aunt Maria glanced at her watch and stood up from the table. "I need to get to the operations building for the morning briefing. Sarah, remember that whatever happens in that hearing room, you've got people in your corner. You did the right thing, and most of us know it." After Maria left, the 3 remaining at the table sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The mess hall was beginning to fill up with the breakfast crowd, pilots, maintenance personnel, and support staff beginning another day in the war zone that had become their temporary home. "Tell me about your family," Chaplain Chun said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I know you've mentioned your parents, but I'd like to hear more about them." Sarah smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "My father is a retired police officer from El Paso, 30 years on the force, most of it in patrol. My mother is an elementary school teacher. She's been at the same school for 25 years now. They've been married for 38 years and they still hold hands when they walk. The image of her parents brought a warmth to Sarah's chest that had been missing for weeks. Miguel and Elena Martinez had immigrated to the United States from Mexico in the early 1970s, working multiple jobs while they learned English and built a life for themselves and the family they hoped to have. They had instilled in their daughter a deep respect for service and sacrifice, values that had ultimately led her to the Air Force Academy and the career that now hung in the balance. "They must be proud of you," Danny observed. "They are," Sarah replied, "but they're also worried. My mother calls every few days, and I can hear the fear in her voice even though she tries to hide it. She doesn't understand why I'm being punished for saving people's lives." "Have you told them about the hearing?" Chaplain Chun asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not the details. They know I'm in some kind of trouble, but I didn't want to worry them more than necessary. My father is the type who would want to fly out here and straighten everything out himself." She laughed softly at the image. "He's never met a problem he couldn't solve with hard work and determination." "Sounds like you take after him," Danny said with a grin. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, touching on family, memories of home, and the dreams that had brought them all to this point in their lives. It was exactly what Sarah. A reminder that there was life beyond this hearing, beyond this deployment, beyond the military structure that currently held her future in its hands. As they prepared to leave the mess hall, Chaplain Chun placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Remember," he said quietly, "courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. You've already shown tremendous courage. Don't lose faith in yourself now." Sarah returned to her quarters to gather her materials for the hearing, but found herself instead standing at her small window, looking out at the flight line where her beloved A-10 sat silent and still. Righteous Fury looked lonely among the other aircraft, her engines cold, her weapons pylons empty. The aircraft that had carried her through 47 combat missions now sat as a monument to her defiance, waiting to see if she would ever fly again. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a physical thing. She thought about the alternative timeline where she had followed orders, where she had turned away from forward operating base redemption and flown back to Bagram as instructed. In that timeline, 127 American soldiers would have died, but her career would be secure. She would still be flying combat missions, still be the reliable Major Martinez who followed orders and stayed within the lines. But in that timeline, she wouldn't be able to look at herself in the mirror. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Danny or perhaps Chaplain Chun with some final words of encouragement. Instead, she found herself face to face with Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, one of the crew chiefs who maintained her aircraft. "Ma'am," Sergeant Walsh said, standing at attention with a formality that seemed out of place in the informal setting of Sarah's quarters. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to speak with you before your hearing." "Of course, Sergeant. Please sit down." Sarah gestured to the folding chair beside her desk. "What's on your mind?" Sergeant Walsh was a 12-year veteran who had worked on A-10s at 3 different bases. She was known throughout the squadron as one of the most skilled and dedicated maintainers in the Air Force, someone who took personal pride in keeping the aircraft mission ready and the pilots safe. Her devotion to righteous fury had been absolute. She knew every rivet, every system, every quirk of the aircraft better than anyone except Sarah herself. "Ma'am, I know it's not my place to comment on officer business," the sergeant began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I've been working on your bird for 8 months now, and I've seen what you do up there. I've seen the mission reports, the gun camera footage, the way you bring our guys home safe." Sarah was touched by the sergeant's words, but she could sense there was more coming. "The thing is, ma'am," Sergeant Walsh continued, "my brother was at forward operating base redemption that day. Private First Class David Walsh, 82nd Airborne. He was one of the soldiers you saved. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had saved 127 lives that day, but they had been statistics to her, numbers on a casualty report, names on a roster she had never seen. The idea that one of those soldiers was directly connected to someone she knew, someone who worked on her aircraft every day, made the reality of her actions suddenly very personal. "Sergeant, I had no idea," Sarah said softly. "He called me 2 days after the attack," Sergeant Walsh continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He said they thought they were all going to die. The Taliban had them surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. Then this A-10 came screaming over the ridge and started tearing the enemy positions apart. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen." Sarah felt her own eyes beginning to water. This was why she had made her choice, not for abstract principles or military glory, but for young soldiers like Private Walsh who had volunteered to serve their country and deserved to come home to their families. "He doesn't know that his sister maintains the aircraft that saved his life," Sergeant Walsh said with a small smile. "I haven't told him yet. But I wanted you to know that what you did that day, It mattered. It mattered to him, and it matters to me." The sergeant stood up and moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Ma'am, whatever those officers decide in that hearing room, you did the right thing. Don't ever doubt that." After Sergeant Walsh left, Sarah sat alone in her quarters for several minutes, overwhelmed by the personal dimension that had just been added to her situation. She had known intellectually that her actions had saved lives, but hearing about Private Walsh made it real in a way that statistics and after-action reports could never accomplish. She thought about her own motivations for joining the Air Force, about the young woman who had walked through the gates of the academy 15 years earlier with dreams of serving her country and flying fast jets. That woman had been shaped by her parents' example of service and sacrifice, by a deep belief that America was worth defending, and by a romantic notion of military aviation that had been forged by watching Top Gun too many times as a teenager. Reality of military service had been both more mundane and more profound than her youthful expectations. The day-to-day routine of military life was filled with bureaucracy, politics, and the endless small frustrations that came with any large organization. But it was also punctuated by moments of extraordinary meaning, moments when the abstract concepts of duty and honor became concrete in the form of lives saved and missions accomplished. Her flight training had been the most challenging thing she had ever undertaken. The academic demands were crushing, the flight requirements unforgiving, and the social pressures of being one of only 3 women in her pilot training class had been constant. But she had persevered through determination, natural ability, and the support of instructors who saw potential in the young lieutenant who refused to quit. The transition to combat operations had been another revelation entirely. No amount of training could fully prepare a pilot for the reality of flying missions where people were trying to kill you, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and disaster, between life and death. Sarah had discovered that she had a talent for close air support work, an intuitive understanding of how to coordinate with ground forces, and an ability to remain calm under pressure that served her well in the chaotic environment of combat. Over the years, she had developed a reputation as someone who could be counted on in difficult situations. Other pilots sought her advice on tactical problems. Ground controllers specifically requested her aircraft for the most challenging missions. She had received commendations from commanders who valued her skill and reliability. All of that was now at risk because she had chosen to save lives rather than follow orders. A glance at her watch told her it was time to leave for the hearing. Sarah gathered her materials, copies of regulations, mission reports, and character references from superiors and subordinates alike, and headed for the door. But as she reached for the handle, her eyes fell on the photograph of her flight school class, and she found herself studying the faces of her classmates. Where were they now? Captain Jennifer Park had left the Air Force after her initial commitment to work for an airline. Major Robert Kim had been killed in a helicopter crash in Iraq 3 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson was now flying a desk at the Pentagon, his combat days behind him. Each of them had followed their own path through the challenges and opportunities of military service, making choices that had shaped their lives and careers. Now, it was Sarah's turn to face a choice that would define her future. She could express regret for her actions, acknowledge that she had violated orders, and hope that the board would show leniency based on the positive results of her insubordination. That might save her career, allow her to continue flying, and preserve the life she had built over 15 years of service. Or she could stand by her actions completely, defend her decision as not just tactically sound, but morally necessary, and accept whatever consequences followed. That approach might end her career, but it would preserve her integrity and send a message about the importance of doing what was right even when it was difficult. As she walked across the base toward the operations building where the hearing would be held, Sarah realized that the choice had already been made. She had decided 3 weeks ago over forward operating base redemption when she had chosen conscience over compliance. Everything that followed was simply the logical conclusion of that decision. The operations building was a utilitarian structure that housed the squadron's administrative offices, briefing rooms, and command centers. Sarah had spent countless hours in this building over the months of her deployment, attending mission briefings, debriefings, and the routine meetings that kept military operations functioning. But this morning, it felt different, more like a courthouse than a military facility. She was directed to a conference room on the 2nd floor, where the disciplinary board had been convened. Outside the door, she encountered Captain Jake Patterson, her academy classmate and the F-16 pilot who had been sent to intercept her 3 weeks earlier. Jake looked uncomfortable in his dress uniform, his usual easy smile replaced by an expression of concern and uncertainty. "Sarah," he said quietly as she approached, "how are you holding up?" "I've been better," she admitted. "Jake, about what happened up there?" He held up a hand to stop her. "You don't need to explain anything to me. I understand why you did what you did. I just wish it hadn't put us in that position." "Are you testifying today?" Sarah asked. Jake nodded reluctantly. "The board wants to hear from everyone who had direct contact with you during the incident." "I'll tell them what happened, nothing more. But Sarah... He paused, searching for the right words. "I want you to know that if I had been in your position, if I had been the one with eyes on those soldiers, I would have made the same choice." The admission clearly cost him something to make, and Sarah was grateful for his honesty. "Thank you, Jake. That means more than you know." Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a staff officer who informed Sarah that the board was ready to convene. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform one final time, and walked through the door to face her fate. The conference room had been transformed into a formal hearing chamber. A long table at the front of the room seated the 3-member disciplinary board: Colonel Patricia Williams from Air Force Headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Johnson from the Base Legal Office, and Colonel Bradley himself, whose presence as both her accuser and her judge struck Sarah as fundamentally unfair, but entirely typical of military justice. Sarah took her assigned seat at a smaller table facing the board, her military attorney beside her. Major Lisa Chun was a competent JAG officer who had reviewed Sarah's case thoroughly and had advised her on the various strategies available for her defense. But in the end, the attorney had agreed that Sarah's best approach was simply to tell the truth and let the board decide whether her actions had been justified. Colonel Williams called the hearing to order and began reading the charges against Sarah. The formal language of military justice made her actions sound sterile and bureaucratic. Willful disobedience of a direct order from a superior officer, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and violation of Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But beneath the legal terminology was a simple human story, a pilot who had chosen to save lives rather than follow orders, and a military system that was struggling to determine whether such a choice could be tolerated within its ranks. As the proceedings began in earnest, Sarah found herself thinking once again about the soldiers at Forward Operating Base Redemption, about Private Walsh and his 126 comrades, who had gone home to their families because she had chosen conscience over compliance, whatever happened. In this room, that choice had been worth making. Colonel Bradley's voice filled the conference room with the cold precision of a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of military authority. Major Martinez, you stand accused of willfully disobeying a direct order from a superior officer during combat operations on March 15th. Before we proceed with witness testimony, do you wish to make any statement regarding the charges? Sarah rose from her chair, her spine straight and her voice steady despite the turbulence she felt inside. Yes, sir. I acknowledge that I disobeyed your direct order to return to base. I do not dispute the facts as they have been presented. However, I respectfully maintain that my actions were justified by the tactical situation and the imminent threat to American lives. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the assembled officers. Sarah could see Colonel Bradley's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, his weathered face betraying just a hint of the anger that had been building for 3 weeks. She had not only disobeyed him in the moment, but was now refusing to show remorse for that disobedience. In his mind, she was compounding her original sin with continued defiance. Colonel Williams, the senior officer on the panel and a veteran of 4 combat deployments herself, leaned forward slightly. Major Martinez, are you familiar with Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Yes, ma'am. Article 92 covers failure to obey order or regulation. I am fully aware of the maximum penalties involved, which include dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement, Colonel Williams continued. These are serious charges, Major. The military cannot function without discipline and adherence to the chain of command. I hope you understand the gravity of your situation. Sarah met the colonel's gaze directly. I understand completely, ma'am. But I also understand that 127 American soldiers are alive today because I chose to act on my conscience rather than blindly follow orders. I am prepared to accept the consequences of that choice. The tension in the room was palpable. Major Chun, Sarah's attorney, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly wishing her client would show more contrition and less defiance. But Sarah had made her decision weeks ago over the mountains of Afghanistan, and she wasn't going to abandon her principles now for the sake of political expedience. Very well, Colonel Williams said after a moment. Let's proceed with witness testimony. Colonel Bradley, please present your account of the events. What followed was a meticulous reconstruction of the morning that had changed everything. Colonel Bradley spoke with the measured cadence of a professional briefer, laying out the timeline of events with military precision. His version of the story painted Sarah as a rogue pilot who had ignored repeated direct orders from lawful authority, compromising the chain of command and setting a dangerous precedent for future operations. At 0847 hours, I explicitly ordered Major Martinez to return to base, Colonel Bradley testified. She acknowledged the order but failed to comply. At 0852 hours, I repeated the order with greater emphasis, making it clear that she was not authorized to engage enemy targets. Again, she failed to comply. At 0856 hours, I warned her that continued disobedience would result in court-martial proceedings. Her response was to continue engaging enemy targets in direct violation of my explicit orders. The colonel's recitation was factually accurate, but devoid of context. He made no mention of the desperate calls for help from Forward Operating Base Redemption, no reference to the tactical situation that had prompted Sarah's decision, no acknowledgement of the lives that hung in the balance. In his telling, it was simply a story of insubordination and the breakdown of military discipline. Colonel Bradley, Major Chen interjected during the cross-examination. Were you aware of the tactical situation at Forward Operating Base Redemption when you issued your orders to Major Martinez? I was aware that the base was under attack. Bradley replied stiffly. However, that does not excuse insubordination. There are proper channels for requesting close air support. Major Martinez was not authorized to provide such support without explicit permission from higher authority. But sir, were you also aware that higher authority, specifically the Commanding General of Air Operations, subsequently authorized Major Martinez to continue her mission? Colonel Bradley's face darkened. That authorization came after Major Martinez had already violated my direct orders. The General's decision to retroactively authorize her actions does not excuse her initial insubordination. This was the heart of the matter, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah had acted first and received authorization second, a sequence of events that violated every principle of military hierarchy while simultaneously saving American lives. The question before the board was whether the positive outcome justified the breach of discipline. The next witness was Captain Jake Patterson, who looked deeply uncomfortable as he took his place at the witness table. Jake had been Sarah's friend for over a decade, but today he was testifying as an instrument of military justice, bound by oath to tell the truth regardless of personal loyalty. Captain Patterson, Colonel Williams began, please describe your interaction with Major Martinez during the incident in question. Jake's voice was steady but strained as he recounted his role in the events. Ma'am, I was ordered to intercept Major Martinez and escort her back to base. When I made contact with her aircraft, she was engaged in close air support operations over Forward Operating Base Redemption. I ordered her to return to base, but she declined to comply. How did she respond to your orders? She told me that she couldn't abandon the soldiers on the ground, ma'am. She said she had taken an oath to support and defend, and that those soldiers were depending on her. Colonel Bradley leaned forward. Captain Patterson, were you authorized to use force to compel Major Martinez to return to base? Jake's discomfort was obvious now. Yes, sir. I was given authorization to use whatever force was necessary to end her unauthorized engagement and bring her back to base. And why didn't you follow those orders? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jake was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because before I could act, General Morrison authorized Major Martinez to continue her mission. The situation changed, sir. It was a careful answer, technically accurate but incomplete. Sarah could see that Jake was protecting himself, avoiding any admission that he had been reluctant to fire on a fellow American pilot who was saving American lives. She couldn't blame him for his caution. His career was on the line, just as much as hers. The testimony continued with a parade of witnesses who had been involved in various aspects of the incident. The air traffic controller who had relayed Colonel Bradley's orders testified about the confusion in the control tower as events unfolded. The intelligence officer who had been monitoring enemy communications testified about the tactical situation at Forward Operating Base Redemption. The operations officer who had coordinated the relief force testified about the timeline of the rescue operation. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. But the picture that emerged was complex and contradictory. Sarah had clearly violated orders, but she had also clearly saved lives. The military system had clearly been circumvented, but it had also clearly failed to respond quickly enough to prevent a disaster. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Colonel Marcus Thompson, the commander of Forward Operating Base Redemption, who had been flown to Bagram specifically to testify before the board. Thompson was a 20-year veteran who commanded the respect of everyone who knew him. A soldier's soldier who had earned his position through competence and courage rather than political maneuvering. "Gentlemen, ma'am," Thompson began, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I want to be very clear about what happened at my base that morning. We were facing annihilation. 500 enemy fighters had surrounded our position, and we were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Our communications were down, our air defenses were destroyed, and we had no way to call for immediate support through normal channels." Thompson paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the board members. "When Major Martinez appeared over our position, she saved our lives. Not just some of our lives, all of our lives. Every single soldier at Forward Operating Base Redemption owes their life to her decision to engage those enemy positions despite orders to the contrary." Colonel Bradley interrupted. "Colonel Thompson, while I appreciate the gravity of your situation, the fact remains that Major Martinez violated direct orders. The military cannot function if officers pick and choose which orders to follow based on their personal judgment." Thompson's response was immediate and forceful. "With respect, sir, that's exactly what the military should do. We train our officers to think, to assess situations, and to make decisions based on their professional judgment. Major Martinez saw American soldiers in mortal danger and acted to save them. That's not insubordination, that's leadership." The rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that Colonel Bradley actually took a step back. Thompson had served in more combat zones than anyone else in the room, and his credibility on matters of life and death was unassailable. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, "the idea that Major Martinez should have waited for proper authorization while my soldiers died is not just wrong, it's immoral. Military discipline serves a purpose, but that purpose is to make us more effective at protecting American lives, not less effective." The colonel's testimony created a schism in the room that was almost visible. Sarah could see the board members exchanging glances, their certainty about the case beginning to crack under the weight of Thompson's words. Here was a respected combat commander arguing that insubordination was not only justified, but morally required under the circumstances. But Colonel Bradley wasn't finished with his case. His next witness was Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the operations officer who had been coordinating air support requests that morning. Morrison's testimony painted a different picture of the events, one that emphasized the chaos and confusion that Sarah's actions had created within the command structure. "The unauthorized engagement by Major Martinez disrupted our entire air tasking order," Morrison testified. "We had F-16 scrambling to intercept her. We had close air support assets being diverted from other missions, and we had a complete breakdown in the coordination of air operations. Her actions may have helped one base, but they compromised our ability to support other operations throughout the theater." This was a more sophisticated argument against Sarah's actions, not just that she had violated orders, but that her violation had broader consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. Morrison was arguing that military discipline existed for systemic reasons, and that individual acts of heroism could undermine the larger framework that kept all operations functioning. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison," Major Chun asked during cross-examination, "are you aware of any other operations that were negatively impacted by the brief reallocation of resources to deal with Major Martinez's actions?" Morrison hesitated. "Well, no specific operations were compromised, but the potential for negative impact was significant." "So you're testifying about potential harm rather than actual harm?" "The disruption to command and control was real," Morrison insisted. "Military operations depend on predictability and coordination. Individual officers cannot be allowed to make unilateral decisions that compromise those principles." Sarah listened to this exchange with growing frustration. She understood the importance of military discipline and coordination, but she also understood that rigid adherence to procedure could become a form of moral cowardice. The system was designed to support the mission, not the other way around. Afternoon session brought more witnesses, each adding their perspective to the increasingly complex picture. The maintenance chief testified about the extraordinary reliability of Sarah's aircraft and her reputation as a skilled pilot. The squadron intelligence officer testified about the accuracy of Sarah's target selection and the effectiveness of her engagement. The base chaplain testified about Sarah's character and her reputation for integrity among the enlisted personnel. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Major General Patricia Hayes, the deputy commander of air operations, who appeared via video link from her headquarters in Qatar. General Hayes was a rising star in the Air Force, known for her sharp intellect and her rigid adherence to proper procedure. The issue before this board, General Hayes testified, is not whether Major Martinez's actions achieved positive tactical results. The issue is whether the Air Force can tolerate officers who substitute their personal judgment for lawful orders from superior officers. If we excuse this behavior, regardless of the outcome, we set a precedent that will undermine military discipline throughout the service. General Hayes spoke with the cool authority of someone who had never faced the kind of split-second life-and-death decisions that combat pilots confronted daily. Her testimony was legally sound and procedurally correct, but it was also bloodless and abstract in a way that seemed to miss the human dimension of Sarah's choice. General Hayes, Colonel Williams asked, "Are you familiar with the concept of unlawful orders?" "Of course. Military personnel are not required to obey orders that are clearly illegal or immoral." "In your opinion, was Colonel Bradley's order for Major Martinez to return to base unlawful?" "Absolutely not. It was a lawful order issued by a superior officer within the scope of his command authority." This exchange highlighted one of the fundamental tensions in military law, the balance between obedience and conscience. Sarah's actions hadn't involved disobeying an unlawful order in the strict legal sense, but they had involved choosing a higher moral imperative over immediate tactical orders. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself studying the faces of the board members, trying to gauge their reactions to the conflicting testimony. Colonel Williams maintained a poker face that revealed nothing about her thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson took extensive notes, but asked few questions. Colonel Bradley's position was obvious. He wanted Sarah punished for her insubordination. Regardless of the consequences, the final witness of the day was Sarah herself. As she took her place at the witness table, she felt the weight of everyone's attention focused on her like a laser. This was her chance to tell her side of the story, to explain her thinking and justify her actions. But it was also an opportunity to hang herself if she said the wrong thing. "Major Martinez," Colonel Williams began, "please tell the board, in your own words, what happened on the morning of March 15th. Sarah had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but now that it was here, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from a prepared script. She described the routine patrol that had become a life-or-death crisis, the desperate calls for help from forward operating base redemption, and the impossible choice she had faced between following orders and saving lives. "I understand that I violated Colonel Bradley's direct orders," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I don't dispute that fact. But I also believe that those orders, while lawful, were wrong. They prioritized procedure over people, protocol over principle. When I looked down at that base and saw American soldiers fighting for their lives, I couldn't turn away. My oath as an officer requires me to support and defend, and that's exactly what I did." Colonel Bradley's face was stone as Sarah spoke, but she could see the anger burning behind his eyes. She was not just defending her actions, she was implicitly criticizing his leadership and his decision-making. In his mind, she was doubling down on her insubordination rather than showing the contrition that might have saved her career. "Major Martinez," Bradley said during his cross-examination, Do you understand that your actions have set a precedent that could encourage other officers to disobey orders whenever they disagree with their superiors? Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, I hope my actions have set a precedent that officers will think for themselves and act on their conscience when American lives are at stake. Military discipline is important, but it should never become an excuse for moral cowardice. The words hit the room like a bomb. Sarah had just accused her superior officer of moral cowardice in front of a disciplinary board, a statement that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her utterly. There was no middle ground left. Colonel Bradley's voice was ice cold when he responded. Major Martinez, your arrogance is matched only by your insubordination. You have shown complete disrespect for the chain of command and for the officers who have dedicated their careers to serving this country. Your actions were not heroic, they were selfish and destructive. Sarah felt the urge to respond, to defend herself against the personal attack, but Major Chun placed a restraining hand on her arm. The damage was done both to Bradley's case and to Sarah's career. The hearing had become a public airing of fundamental disagreements about military leadership and moral responsibility. As the proceedings concluded for the day, Sarah realized that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple disciplinary matter. She had become a symbol of a larger debate about the nature of military service and the balance between obedience and conscience. The board would not just be deciding her fate, they would be making a statement about what kind of military the Air Force wanted to be. Walking back to her quarters under the darkening Afghan sky, Sarah reflected on the day's testimony and the crossroads she had reached. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and a decision that would determine not just her future, but the message the military would send to every officer who might someday face a similar choice between orders and conscience. She thought about Private Walsh, still serving at Forward Operating Base Redemption, still alive because she had chosen to act rather than obey. Whatever happened tomorrow, that choice had been worth making. But the cost of that choice was only beginning to become clear. The second day of the hearing began with an unexpected development that sent shockwaves through the assembled officers and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the proceedings. As the board members took their seats and prepared to hear closing arguments, Colonel Williams received a message that caused her to call for an immediate recess. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, this board has just received new information that requires our immediate attention. We will reconvene in 1 hour. The cryptic announcement left everyone in the conference room buzzing with speculation. Sarah exchanged worried glances with Major Chun, wondering if some new evidence had emerged that would further complicate her already precarious situation. The uncertainty was agonizing, but there was nothing to do but wait and see what revelations the morning would bring. When the board reconvened, Colonel Williams called for a new witness, one who had not been on the previous day's schedule. The board calls General Robert Morrison to testify. A murmur ran through the room as the three-star general who commanded all air operations in Afghanistan entered and took his place at the witness table. General Morrison was a legend in the Air Force, a pilot who had flown combat missions and combat missions in 3 different wars and whose judgment was respected throughout the service. His presence at the hearing was both unprecedented and significant. General Morrison, Colonel Williams began, thank you for taking time from your schedule to appear before this board. Can you please tell us why you authorized Major Martinez to continue her mission after she had been ordered to return to base? The general's response was measured but powerful. Colonel Williams, I authorized Major Martinez to continue her mission because her assessment of the tactical situation was correct and her actions were saving American lives. When I was briefed on the situation at Forward Operating Base Redemption, it became clear that immediate air support was the only thing standing between those soldiers and annihilation. General, were you aware that Major Martinez had disobeyed direct orders from Colonel Bradley when you made that authorization? I was fully aware of the command situation, Morrison replied. But I was also aware that rigidly following proper procedure would result in the deaths of 127 American service members. In my judgment, Major Martinez had made the right tactical decision, and my authorization was intended to support her actions. Colonel. Bradley leaned forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. General Morrison, with respect, doesn't your authorization undermine the entire chain of command? If officers can circumvent their immediate superiors by appealing to higher authority, how can any commander maintain discipline? General Morrison's response was swift and uncompromising. Colonel Bradley, the chain of command exists to facilitate effective military operations, not to prevent them. When the chain of command becomes an obstacle to saving American lives, it needs to be circumvented. That's not a breakdown of discipline, that's leadership. The general's words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before the entire military justice system. Here was the highest-ranking officer in the theater explicitly endorsing insubordination when it served a higher purpose. The implications were staggering, but General Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, this board needs to understand the broader context of Major Martinez's actions. The intelligence failures that led to the attack on forward operating base redemption were systemic. Our surveillance systems missed the movement of 500 enemy fighters into position around the base. Our communication systems failed when they were needed most. Our rapid response protocols proved inadequate to the FIGWAN threat. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The general was revealing failures in the command structure that went far beyond her. Individual actions failures that had put American soldiers at risk and forced her to make the choice that now threatened her career. General, Colonel Williams asked carefully, are you suggesting that Major Martinez's insubordination was necessitated by failures elsewhere in the command structure? I'm suggesting that Major Martinez did what any competent officer should do when faced with a life or death situation that the system was failing to address. She assessed the tactical situation, made a decision based on her professional judgment, and acted to save American lives. That's exactly what we train our officers to do. The general's testimony was devastating to the case against Sarah, but it was also devastating to the careers of several officers who had been responsible for the intelligence and operational failures he was describing. Sarah realized that her disciplinary hearing had become the focal point for a much larger reckoning about military competence and accountability. Colonel Bradley attempted to recover some ground during his cross-examination. General Morrison, don't you think there's a difference between using professional judgment within the parameters of lawful orders and completely disregarding those orders? Colonel, there's a difference between orders that serve the mission and orders that obstruct the mission. Major Martinez was given orders that would have resulted in the deaths of American soldiers. Her professional judgment told her those orders were wrong, and she was correct. The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, with Colonel Bradley's authority being systematically dismantled by his superior officer. Sarah could see the anger and humiliation building in Bradley's face as his case collapsed under the weight of General Morrison's testimony. But the general had one more revelation that would completely transform the proceedings. Colonel Williams, there's something else this board needs to know. The investigation into the intelligence failures at Forward Operating Base Redemption has revealed evidence of serious misconduct by officers in the command structure. A shocked silence fell over the room. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as she realized that the hearing was about to take another dramatic turn. What kind of misconduct, General? Colonel Williams asked. The kind that compromised operational security and put American lives at risk, Morrison replied grimly. The FBI is currently investigating evidence that classified information about Forward Operating Base Redemption's defensive capabilities was leaked to enemy forces. That's how 500 Taliban fighters were able to position themselves for a coordinated assault without being detected. The bombshell revelation sent shockwaves through the conference room. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. The attack on Forward Operating Base Redemption hadn't been a tactical surprise. It had been enabled by treachery within their own ranks. Colonel Williams called for another recess as the board members absorbed this stunning development. During the break, Sarah found herself in whispered conversation with Major Chun, trying to understand how this new information would affect her case. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. This changes everything, Chun said quietly. If there was a security breach that enabled the attack, then your actions weren't just justified, they were heroic. You saved American lives that were put at risk by American traitors. When the hearing resumed, General Morrison continued his testimony with methodical precision, laying out the details of the investigation that had been conducted parallel to Sarah's disciplinary proceedings. The FBI investigation began immediately after the attack on Forward Operating Base Redemption, Morrison explained. Agent Sarah Hartwell from the Bureau's Counterintelligence Division discovered anomalies in communication, patterns that suggested classified information had been transmitted outside secure channels. A new witness was called, FBI Special Agent Hartwell herself, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to testifying in high-stakes legal proceedings. Agent Hartwell, Colonel Williams began. Can you tell this board what your investigation has revealed about the security breaches related to Forward Operating Base Redemption? Agent Hartwell consulted her notes before responding. Our investigation has revealed a pattern of unauthorized communications between certain Air Force personnel and individuals suspected of having connections to Taliban intelligence networks. Classified information about troop strength, defensive positions, and operational schedules was systematically transmitted over a period of 3 months prior to the attack. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and horror wash over her. She had been right to act on her instincts that morning, but the revelation that American personnel had been actively working to undermine their own forces was almost incomprehensible. Agent Hartwell, Colonel Bradley interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Are you suggesting that officers under my command were involved in this conspiracy? The FBI agent's response was measured but damning. Colonel Bradley, I'm stating that our investigation has identified 3 individuals within your command structure who were actively transmitting classified information to enemy agents. 2 of those individuals have been arrested, and a 3rd is currently under surveillance. The revelation hit Colonel Bradley like a physical blow. His face went ashen as he realized that while he had been focused on punishing Sarah for insubordination, actual traitors had been operating within his own command. The irony was devastating. He had court-martialed the officer who saved American lives while failing to detect the officers who had endangered them. General Morrison resumed his testimony, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. This board needs to understand that Major Martinez's actions on March 5th weren't just tactically sound, they were strategically essential. The enemy had detailed intelligence about our response capabilities, our air support protocols, and our command structure. They knew exactly how long it would take for properly authorized air support to arrive, and they had planned their assault accordingly. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full picture emerged. She had saved those soldiers not just from the immediate tactical threat, but from a conspiracy that had been specifically designed to ensure they would die before help could arrive. Major Martinez disrupted that timeline, Morrison continued. Her unauthorized engagement prevented the enemy from achieving their strategic objective, which was to inflict maximum American casualties while our command structure followed proper procedure. In essence, her insubordination saved American lives that had been deliberately put at risk by American traitors. The general's words reframed everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks. Sarah's court-martial wasn't just about military discipline. It was about whether the Air Force would punish the officer who had exposed the inadequacy of their security procedures by acting outside them. Agent Hartwell provided additional details about the conspiracy that made the scope of the betrayal even clearer. The arrested individuals had access to detailed operational plans, communication schedules, and personnel rosters. They knew that forward operating base Redemption was undermanned and under-equipped. They knew that standard air support response times would be insufficient to prevent a coordinated assault. They provided all of this information to enemy forces. Colonel Williams asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Agent Hartwell, in your professional opinion, would the soldiers at forward operating base Redemption have survived if Major Martinez had followed standard procedures and returned to base as ordered? The FBI agent's response was unequivocal. No, ma'am. The enemy assault was specifically timed to exploit the gap between the initial attack and the arrival of properly authorized air support. Every soldier at that base would have been killed if Major Martinez had not intervened when she did. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah had not just saved 127 lives, she had prevented a massacre that had been orchestrated by traitors within their own ranks. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, who had been silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke up. General Morrison, given this new information, what is your recommendation regarding Major Martinez's disciplinary case? Morrison's response was immediate and forceful. My recommendation is that all charges against Major Martinez be dismissed immediately and that she be commended for her actions. Furthermore, I recommend that this case serve as an example of why our officers need to be trained to think critically and act decisively when lives are at stake. But the revelations weren't finished. Agent Hartwell had one more piece of information that would completely vindicate Sarah's actions while exposing the depth of the conspiracy against American forces. There's something else this board needs to know, the FBI agent said. Our investigation has revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond just intelligence sharing. The traitors were actively working to delay and complicate air support responses to ensure maximum American casualties. Sarah felt her blood run cold. What do you mean? Colonel Williams asked. I mean that certain officers were deliberately creating procedural obstacles and communication delays to prevent rapid response to emergency situations. The rigid adherence to proper authorization procedures wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency, it was sabotage. The implication was staggering. The very system that Colonel Bradley had been defending, the system of careful authorization and proper procedure, had been weaponized by traitors to ensure that American soldiers would die before help could arrive. General Morrison's face was grim as he absorbed this final revelation. Agent Hartwell, are you saying that the emphasis on following proper procedures was itself part of the conspiracy? Not entirely, General. But the conspirators were exploiting that emphasis to create delays that would serve their purposes. They knew that good officers like Colonel Bradley would follow procedures, even when those procedures prevented effective action. The words hung in the air like an indictment of the entire command structure. Sarah realized that she had not just been fighting for the lives of soldiers on the ground. She had been fighting against a system that had been deliberately corrupted to serve enemy interests. Colonel Bradley's reaction to these revelations was a mixture of rage and devastation. The man who had spent 3 weeks trying to court-martial Sarah for insubordination now realized that his rigid adherence to procedure had been exactly what the traitors were counting on. General Morrison, Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper, if what Agent Hartwell is saying is true, then my insistence on proper procedure, my orders to Major Martinez, your orders would have resulted in exactly what the enemy wanted, Morrison confirmed quietly. A massacre of American soldiers while their superior officers followed the rules that the traitors had manipulated to serve their purposes. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system, as everyone absorbed the full scope of what had been revealed. Sarah's case had exposed not just intelligence failures and security breaches, but a fundamental corruption of the military decision-making process. Major Chin leaned over to whisper in Sarah's ear, "This is over. Not only are you vindicated, but you're going to be decorated for this." But Sarah was thinking about something larger than her own vindication. The conspiracy that had been revealed meant that other American units might be at risk, that other operations might have been compromised, that the security failures went far deeper than anyone had imagined. General Morrison seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "Agent Hartwell, how extensive is this conspiracy? Are there other units at risk? Other operations that have been compromised?" The FBI agent's response was sobering. "Our investigation is ongoing, General. What we've uncovered so far appears to be part of a broader network of infiltration and sabotage. We're working with military intelligence to identify all compromised personnel and operations." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Sarah realized that her actions over Forward Operating Base Redemption had not just saved 127 lives. They had exposed a cancer within the military structure that could have cost thousands of lives if left unchecked. Colonel Williams called for a final recess to allow the board members to deliberate on the new evidence. But Sarah could see in their faces that the deliberation was largely a formality. The case against her had not just collapsed, it had been completely inverted. She was no longer the officer who had violated military discipline. She was the officer who had exposed the inadequacy of that discipline when faced with systemic corruption. As the hearing reconvened for the final time, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that her career would survive and that her actions had been vindicated. Sadness that it had taken the exposure of treachery to make military leaders understand the importance of moral courage over procedural compliance. Colonel Williams delivered the board's verdict with the formal precision required by military justice, but her words carried an emotional weight that transcended legal procedure. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this board finds that Major Sarah Martinez's actions on March 15th were not only justified but exemplary. The charges against her are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this board recommends that Major Martinez be commended for her courage, her tactical skill, and her moral leadership in the face of systemic failures that put American lives at risk. The words of vindication washed over Sarah like a cleansing rain after weeks of drought. She had been prepared to sacrifice her career for her principles, but instead, her principles had ultimately saved her career while exposing the corruption that threatened every American service member in the theater. But even as she felt the relief of vindication, Sarah knew that the larger battle was just beginning. The conspiracy that had been exposed would require a massive investigation and restructuring of security procedures. The officers who had been complicit would face their own courts-martial. The very culture of military decision-making would need to be examined and reformed. As the hearing concluded and the assembled officers began to file out of the conference room, General Morrison approached Sarah with an expression of deep respect and gratitude. "Major Martinez," he said quietly, "your actions on March 15th saved more than just those 127 soldiers. You saved the integrity of this command. Thank you for having the courage to do what was right, even when it seemed wrong to everyone else." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she responded, "General, I just did what my training and my conscience told me to do. I'm grateful that it turned out to be the right choice." But as she walked out of the conference room and into the bright Afghan sunlight, Sarah realized that the story was far from over. Her vindication was just the beginning of a larger reckoning that would transform military culture and restore the primacy of moral courage over procedural compliance. The revelation of the conspiracy had changed everything. But it had also raised new questions about how such betrayal could be prevented in the future. Sarah's case would become a landmark in military justice, but more importantly, it would become a catalyst for the kind of institutional reform that could save countless lives in future conflicts. 30 years after, Forward Operating Base Redemption. Dr. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the tarmac at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base one final time. At 71, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body bore the accumulated weight of a lifetime, spent in service to principles larger than herself. Today marked not just another anniversary, but the culmination of a journey that had transformed not only her own life, but the very culture of military leadership. The occasion was extraordinary, the final flight of the last operational A-10 Warthog in the United States Air Force. After 5 decades of service, the venerable aircraft that had saved countless lives was finally being retired, replaced by newer technology that promised greater speed and stealth, but could never quite replicate the psychological impact of hearing those twin engines screaming over a battlefield. Sarah had been invited to deliver the farewell address, but she had requested something more personal, a final flight in the back seat of a 2-seat trainer version of the aircraft that had defined her legacy. The Air Force had agreed, understanding the symbolic importance of having the woman who had come to embody A-10 courage take the aircraft's final journey into history. As she approached the gray-green machine, Sarah's mind drifted to all the pilots who had flown similar aircraft over the decades, carrying forward the traditions of close air support and moral courage that her case had helped establish. Captain Jennifer Walsh, now a general herself, commanded an entire wing of F-35 pilots who had been trained in the ethical frameworks that emerged from Forward Operating Base Redemption. Colonel David Walsh, the former private, whose life had been saved that distant morning, served as the director of military ethics at West Point, ensuring that new generations of Army officers understood the importance of moral courage and leadership. Pilot who would fly her on this final mission was Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos III, granddaughter of the Lieutenant Colonel Santos who had served in Sarah's squadron 3 decades earlier. The young pilot's crisp salute and earnest expression reminded Sarah of herself at that age, full of confidence in both the aircraft and the system that deployed it. Dr. Martinez, Lieutenant Colonel Santos said as she helped Sarah into the rear cockpit, "It's an honor to fly with you today. My grandmother always said you taught her that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear." Sarah smiled as she settled into the familiar embrace of the cockpit, her hands automatically finding the controls and displays that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The view through the canopy encompassed not just the Arizona desert, but 30 years of institutional change, thousands of lives touched by the principles of moral courage, and a military culture that had learned to balance discipline with conscience. As the engine spooled up and the aircraft began its taxi to the runway, Sarah thought about the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The young pilot who had defied direct orders to save 127 soldiers had become a symbol of moral leadership whose influence extended far beyond military circles. Her story had been studied in business schools, government agencies, and non-profit organizations around the world, adapted to contexts as diverse as corporate whistleblowing and humanitarian intervention. The A-10 lifted off into the clear desert sky, climbing toward the mountains where Sarah had first learned to fly 3.5 decades earlier. As they reached altitude, Lieutenant Colonel Santos's voice crackled through the intercom. "Dr. Martinez, we're approaching the coordinates of Forward Operating Base Redemption, or at least the training range that represents it. Would you like to take the controls for a moment?" Sarah's hands closed around the stick with surprising steadiness, muscle memory overriding the decades since she had last flown combat aircraft. For a few minutes, she was once again Major Sarah Martinez, streaking across an Afghan valley toward soldiers who needed her help, making the split-second decision that would define not Just her career, but the trajectory of military ethics for generations to come. "This is what it felt like," she said into her microphone, her voice carrying the weight of memory and reflection. Not the technical aspects, the flying, the targeting, the weapons employment, but the moment when you realize that doing your duty means more than following orders. It means serving the deeper purpose that those orders are supposed to protect. As they completed their flight over the symbolic battlefield, Sarah relinquished control back to Lieutenant Colonel Santos and settled into the observer's role that had defined her later career. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to represent all the possibilities that moral courage could unlock when supported by institutional commitment to growth and change. The landing was smooth, a fitting end to both the flight and the era it represented. As the engines wound down and the canopy opened, Sarah was greeted by a crowd that included many of the people who had shaped her journey, former students who had become leaders in their own right, fellow veterans who had carried forward the traditions of ethical decision-making, and family members of the soldiers saved at Forward Operating Base Redemption. But the moment that moved her most came when she was approached by a young airman, barely 18, fresh from basic training, who handed her a folded piece of paper. "Ma'am," the airman said with nervous formality, "my grandfather served at Forward Operating Base Redemption. He wanted me to give you this." Sarah unfolded the paper to find a simple message written in an elderly hand. "Dr. Martinez, I never got to thank you personally for saving my life that day, but I want you to know that I've tried to live every day since then in a way that would honor your courage. My granddaughter is just beginning her Air Force career, and she'll carry forward the values you fought for. The mission continues." As Sarah stood beside the now silent A-10, holding the letter from a soldier whose life had been saved 3 decades earlier, she understood that the true measure of her legacy was not in the awards, promotions, or institutional changes that had followed her actions. It lay in the simple fact that moral courage had become a living tradition, passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that future military leaders would have both the tools and the support they needed to make principled decisions under pressure. The colonel had tried to stop her, but her A-10 had screamed over the ridge, carrying with it a message that would echo through the decades, that true military discipline includes the discipline to do what's right, even when doing right means standing alone against institutional pressure. As the crowd dispersed and the historic aircraft was towed to its final resting place in the museum, Sarah Martinez walked slowly across the tarmac toward the future, satisfied in the knowledge that the principles she had fought for would outlive any individual career or conflict, woven permanently into the fabric of military service itself.